The first thing people noticed about me that night wasn't my name. It wasn't my face. It was the bicycle. I had just stepped off it in front of the Ford Mobility Innovation Gala in downtown Detroit, the kind of event where cameras flashed every few seconds and luxury cars lined the entrance like trophies. Executives in tailored suits were arriving in black SUVs and glossy electric prototypes, while influencers posed beside brand-new vehicles under the glow of spotlights. And there I was, locking a simple matte gray bicycle to the metal railing outside the entrance. I heard the laughter before I even turned around. "My sister," Madison announced loudly behind me, her voice carrying easily through the crowd of guests and photographers, "is the only person I know who would ride a bike to a car launch." A few nearby reporters chuckled. Someone muttered, "Seriously?" Madison stepped closer, her designer heels clicking against the pavement, perfectly styled hair shining under the lights. "She's been like this forever," she continued, smiling at the audience around her. "Forever riding a bike. I'm honestly not sure she'll ever afford a Ford." More laughter followed. I glanced briefly at my watch, not because I was embarrassed, because the timing of the evening mattered. Inside the convention hall, hundreds of guests were gathering for what Ford had described as one of their most important announcements in years. A new electric vehicle production expansion, a strategic partnership, a project that would reshape several manufacturing supply chains across North America. Madison thought the night belonged to her, but the evening had only just begun. I slipped the bicycle lock into my bag and stepped toward the entrance without responding. Madison followed me immediately. "Natalie," she said, still smiling for the cameras, "you could at least pretend to arrive like a normal person." "I arrived on time," I said calmly. "That's not what I meant." My parents approached us from the side, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. My mother glanced at the bicycle, then back at me. "You rode that here?" she asked quietly. "The hotel is only a mile away." My father shook his head slightly. "At a Ford event?" he said. "Natalie, this is exactly the kind of thing that makes people question whether you're taking life seriously." I didn't answer, because this conversation wasn't new. Growing up in our family, success had always been measured in visible symbols: cars, clothes, recognition, and Madison had mastered all three. At 27, she was already a well-known lifestyle influencer across several social platforms. She posted photos beside luxury vehicles, attended brand events, and had over 1 million followers watching every curated detail of her life. Tonight, she had been invited by Ford's marketing team as a featured social media guest. In our parents' eyes, Madison represented everything modern success looked like. I represented the opposite. I dressed simply, I stayed off social media, and when I visited Detroit, I rode a bicycle. Inside the hall, the gala was already in full motion. Spotlights illuminated the stage where Ford executives were preparing for the announcement. Rows of sleek electric prototypes sat on rotating platforms, while guests mingled with champagne glasses in hand. Madison immediately drifted toward a group of photographers who were eager to capture her entrance. "Natalie," she said over her shoulder, "try not to park your bike inside." A few guests laughed again. My father sighed. "You really should think about appearances," he told me quietly. "People assume things." "They usually do," I said. We moved deeper into the hall where the crowd thickened around the stage area. Madison was already posing beside a new electric SUV prototype, while a reporter interviewed her about influencer culture and automotive branding. My mother watched proudly. "Look at her," she whispered to my father. "She belongs here." I followed their gaze for a moment. Madison looked confident beneath the bright lights. Comfortable, visible, exactly the kind of success my family understood. Then my phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I checked the message. The sender's name made me smile slightly. David Lawson, chairman of Ford Mobility. One short text appeared on the screen. "We're ready when you are." I typed a brief reply. Perfect timing. Across the room, Madison's voice rose again as she joked with another group of guests. "My sister still rides a bicycle everywhere," she laughed. "It's honestly adorable." More people laughed. My parents didn't correct her. They never did. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and glanced toward the stage where the executives were beginning to take their seats. The announcement would start in less than 10 minutes, and when it did, the entire room was about to discover something my family had never bothered to learn. The girl who arrived on a bicycle wasn't just a guest at the Ford Gala. I was the reason the event existed. The ballroom of the Detroit Convention Center shimmered under rows of suspended lights, each reflecting off polished chrome vehicles arranged across the hall like sculptures. The entire space smelled faintly of leather interiors and fresh paint, the scent of new machines and expensive ambition. Guests moved through the room with practiced confidence. Automotive executives in tailored suits, investors speaking quietly in tight circles, journalists adjusting microphones and checking their phones for updates, and everywhere cameras. Madison thrived in this environment. By the time I reached the main floor, she had already positioned herself beside a silver electric SUV on the display platform, one hand resting lightly on the hood while a photographer crouched to capture the angle. "Perfect," the photographer said. "Hold that pose." Madison tilted her head slightly, offering the effortless smile that had earned her hundreds of thousands of followers. Flash. Another photo. She glanced across the room and noticed me standing near the edge of the crowd. "There she is," Madison said loudly enough for the small group around her to hear. "My mysterious sister." Several guests turned toward me. Madison waved her hand in my direction as if presenting an unusual exhibit. "Don't mind the bicycle," she added with a playful laugh. "It's her signature move." A man in a navy suit chuckled. "You biked here? To the Ford Gala?" "It's efficient," I said. Madison shook her head dramatically. "She's been like this since we were kids. Everyone else wanted their first car. Natalie wanted a better bike." More laughter rippled through the group. One woman asked curiously, "So what do you do, Natalie?" "Finance," I answered. Madison immediately jumped in. "That's code for spreadsheets and boring conference calls," she joked. "Nothing glamorous." The guests smiled politely. To them, the conversation was harmless entertainment, but my parents were standing only a few feet away, and I could see the familiar expression on my mother's face. Embarrassment. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice. "Natalie," she whispered, "you really should try to fit in a little more at events like this." "I'm fine, Mom." My father joined us, holding a glass of whiskey. "You know what your mother means," he said. "Presentation matters." Across the room, Madison laughed again as another photographer asked for a quick video clip for social media. "Tell them about the bike," someone in the group urged. Madison grinned. "Oh, this is my favorite story," she said. She turned slightly so the camera faced her. "My sister Natalie," she began dramatically, "has spent her entire adult life refusing to buy a car." The small crowd around her leaned closer. "She rides a bike everywhere," Madison continued, "even tonight, at a car launch." Someone laughed. "That's bold." "Or cheap," another guest said jokingly. Madison raised her glass. "Let's just say she's committed to the brand of not owning a Ford." The comment earned another round of laughter. I didn't react, not because I hadn't heard it, because this pattern had been repeating itself for years. Every family gathering, every holiday dinner, Madison talking about brand deals and new cars, my parents proudly showing relatives photos of her latest partnership. And whenever someone asked what I was doing with my life, the answer always sounded disappointingly vague. Something in finance. The stage lights brightened suddenly as the event host stepped onto the platform. The room began to quiet. Guests gradually moved closer to the stage area, forming rows of chairs and standing clusters around the central presentation space. Madison finished her interview and joined my parents again. "Front row seats," she said proudly, pointing to the reserved section near the stage. "Influencer perks." My mother smiled. "You deserve it." Madison looked at me. "You're welcome to sit with us," she added casually, "although I'm not sure where they park bicycles in the VIP section." I glanced toward the stage where several Ford executives were now gathering behind the podium. David Lawson was among them. He scanned the audience briefly before his eyes landed on me. For just a second, he gave a subtle nod. Madison noticed. "Do you know someone up there?" she asked curiously. "Maybe," I said. She shrugged. "Good for you." The host stepped forward and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall, "welcome to the Ford Mobility Innovation Gala." The room fell completely silent. Behind him, a massive screen lit up with the image of a sleek new electric vehicle platform. "This evening," the host continued, "we're announcing a partnership that will shape the future of electric transportation." Madison leaned toward my parents. "This is the big reveal everyone's been talking about," she whispered. I checked my watch again. The timing was perfect. On stage, David Lawson stepped forward and adjusted the microphone. "Before we begin," he said, scanning the room once more, "there's someone here tonight whose work made this project possible." Madison barely noticed. She was already lifting her phone to start recording the moment for her followers. None of them realized yet that the person David Lawson was looking for was standing only a few feet behind them. David Lawson rested both hands on the podium as the giant screen behind him shifted to a blueprint of Ford's next-generation electric vehicle platform. The room had gone completely quiet. Hundreds of guests leaned forward slightly, the collective anticipation of executives, investors, and media filling the space like pressure in the air. "This project," Lawson began, his voice calm but resonant, "represents one of the most ambitious transitions in Ford's history." Images of battery facilities, manufacturing lines, and supply chain routes appeared behind him as he spoke. To scale electric production across North America, we needed more than engineering innovation. We needed financial strategy, industrial restructuring, and the stability of an entire supply network. Several investors in the front rows nodded. Those words meant something to them. Lawson paused briefly. "And 18 months ago," he continued, "that entire plan was nearly destroyed." The screen behind him changed again. A red warning graph appeared. Supplier collapse risk, manufacturing disruption projections, projected delay, 3 years. Murmurs rippled through the room. Lawson continued calmly. "One of the most critical component manufacturers in our electric vehicle supply chain was weeks away from bankruptcy." A journalist near the front scribbled quickly in a notebook. "Without intervention," Lawson said, "the entire EV rollout you see here tonight would have been postponed indefinitely." Madison leaned toward my parents. "This sounds intense," she whispered. My father nodded. "Supply chains are complicated." On stage, Lawson lifted a remote and clicked forward. A new slide appeared. Supply Chain Stabilization Initiative. "Fortunately," Lawson said, "a private investment group stepped forward to restructure the company, protect the workforce, and stabilize production." Now the audience was fully engaged. Investors whispered quietly. Some reporters were already typing on their phones. Lawson turned slightly toward the crowd. "The firm that led this effort is Harper Strategic Capital." My parents didn't react. They had never heard the name before. Madison barely noticed either. She was still recording video for her followers. Behind Lawson, another slide appeared. Harper Strategic Capital, Strategic Industrial Investment. Lawson smiled slightly. "This firm specializes in restructuring manufacturing supply chains and building long-term industrial partnerships." A few people in the audience nodded with recognition. Some clearly knew the firm well. Lawson continued. "Over the past 5 years, Harper Strategic Capital has quietly financed the recovery of multiple industrial suppliers across North America." Now the room had grown more attentive. Even Madison lowered her phone slightly. "Without their intervention," Lawson said, "the EV program you're celebrating tonight would not exist in its current form." The screen behind him shifted once more. Strategic partnership announcement, Ford Mobility, Harper Strategic Capital. Madison frowned slightly. "Have you heard of them?" she whispered to my father. He shook his head. "Private investment firms don't advertise much." Lawson took a breath. "Tonight, we're proud to formally announce a strategic partnership with Harper Strategic Capital to expand our electric vehicle production capacity." Applause erupted through the room. Investors clapped. Executives nodded approvingly. Madison resumed recording, smiling brightly for her audience. "This is huge," she whispered to the phone camera. "Ford's announcing a massive partnership tonight." Lawson raised one hand gently to quiet the applause. "There is one more thing," he said. The room gradually settled again. Lawson looked out across the audience slowly. "The founder of Harper Strategic Capital is here tonight." Several reporters immediately lifted their heads. A ripple of curiosity spread through the hall. Lawson stepped away from the podium. Instead of continuing the speech from the stage, he began walking down the steps toward the crowd. The room followed him with their eyes. Madison whispered to my parents, "Probably some billionaire investor." Lawson continued moving through the audience until he reached the open floor area near where I was standing. He stopped a few feet away. The entire room was watching. Madison turned slightly, trying to see who he was approaching. Then Lawson bowed his head slightly in my direction. "Ms. Harper," he said respectfully. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Madison blinked. My parents looked confused. Lawson extended his hand toward me. "Thank you for everything you've done to make this project possible." Hundreds of eyes turned at once. Madison's phone slowly lowered from her hand. My father stared at Lawson, then at me. Lawson gestured politely toward the stage. "Would you join us?" For a moment, nobody moved. Madison looked at me as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become impossible. "You," she whispered. I stepped forward calmly and shook Lawson's hand. Then I turned toward the stage. Behind me, the entire room erupted into shocked murmurs, and the sister who had arrived on a bicycle walked past rows of stunned guests toward the center of the Ford announcement. The walk from the crowd to the stage felt longer than it actually was. Hundreds of eyes followed every step I took across the polished floor of the Detroit Convention Center ballroom. Conversations that had filled the hall only seconds earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet wave of confusion spreading through the audience. Behind me, I could hear Madison whispering sharply. "Wait, what?" My father's voice followed. "That can't be right." David Lawson stepped aside as I reached the stage and gestured toward the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone again, his tone now warmer, "please allow me to introduce the founder and CEO of Harper Strategic Capital." He paused for a moment. "Natalie Harper." The room exploded with sound. Not laughter, shock. Some guests immediately began clapping while others stared openly, trying to process what they had just heard. Across the hall, several journalists rushed closer to the stage, cameras rising quickly as they realized the story unfolding in front of them. Madison stood frozen near the front rows. Her phone had slipped halfway down in her hand. My mother stared at the stage as if the lights themselves had suddenly become blinding. My father didn't move at all. I stepped up to the podium and adjusted the microphone slightly. For a moment, the hall remained filled with murmurs. Then the sound slowly faded as people realized I was about to speak. "Thank you, David," I said calmly. My voice carried clearly across the room. "Ford has been one of the most important industrial innovators in American history, so working with your team over the past 18 months has been a privilege." Several executives in the front rows nodded. Behind me, the giant screen displayed the Harper Strategic Capital logo beside Ford Mobility's. 18 months ago, I continued, a critical supplier within Ford's electric vehicle supply chain was facing collapse. The screen behind me changed again. Financial graphs appeared, production risk charts, manufacturing projections. The company had strong technology, I explained, but a debt structure that made survival impossible without restructuring. A few investors in the audience leaned forward, recognizing the complexity of the situation. Our firm stepped in to redesign the company's capital structure, stabilize its operations, and secure long-term financing for expansion. The screen shifted to images of manufacturing plants and assembly lines returning to operation. "Because of that work," I said, "over 4,000 manufacturing jobs were protected, and the EV platform you're celebrating tonight remained on schedule." Applause began slowly. Then it grew louder. Not the polite applause of a gala audience, the kind of applause investors give when they understand the scale of a deal. I glanced briefly across the crowd. Madison was still staring at the stage. The confident smile she had worn earlier had completely vanished. Her expression had been replaced by something else entirely. Confusion. Beside her, my parents looked just as stunned. David Lawson stepped forward again. "For those of you who may not know," he added to the audience, "Harper Strategic Capital currently manages several industrial investment funds focused on manufacturing and supply chain resilience." The screen behind him displayed another slide. Portfolio overview, multiple manufacturing firms, industrial infrastructure investments, energy supply chain projects. Under Natalie's leadership, Lawson continued, the firm has become one of the most influential private investors in industrial recovery projects across North America. Several reporters began speaking quietly into their microphones. Founder revealed, Harper Strategic Capital CEO. Unexpected identity. I stepped back from the podium slightly as Lawson finished. The presentation continued for a few more minutes, outlining the details of the Ford partnership and the future EV production expansion. But the mood of the room had shifted permanently. This was no longer just a product launch. It had become a revelation. When the formal announcement ended, the audience stood and applauded again. Investors approached the stage, executives extended their hands, cameras flashed continuously. Through the crowd, I saw Madison still standing in the same place. For the first time in her life, she looked completely lost in a room full of attention. My father turned slowly toward her. You said she works in finance, he muttered. Madison didn't answer, because the reality unfolding in front of her was impossible to explain with the assumptions she had built her life around. I stepped down from the stage and walked back toward the floor. Reporters began moving quickly in my direction, but before they reached me, I saw something else. My family standing only a few feet away. Madison's voice came out barely above a whisper. Natalie. For the first time that evening, she wasn't laughing, and the joke about the bicycle had suddenly stopped being funny. The applause had barely faded when the crowd began to move. Reporters stepped forward first, microphones already raised. Photographers pushed closer to the stage, lenses focusing rapidly as they tried to capture the moment while it was still unfolding. But I didn't move toward them. Instead, I stepped down from the stage and paused near the bottom of the stairs. The energy in the room had changed completely. Earlier, the attention had belonged to the cars, the lights, the spectacle of the Ford launch. Now the attention had shifted. Toward me, toward the quiet investor most of the room hadn't even noticed an hour earlier. A reporter reached me first. Ms. Harper, she said quickly, holding out a microphone. When did you begin working with Ford on this project? 18 months ago, I replied. Was the supplier rescue planned from the beginning? No, I said. It became necessary when the debt structure collapsed. More reporters were gathering. Another voice asked, Is Harper Strategic Capital planning additional investments in the EV sector? We evaluate opportunities carefully, I answered, but electric infrastructure will be a major part of the next decade. Cameras flashed again. Across the room, I noticed Madison. She hadn't moved. She was still standing beside my parents, watching the small crowd forming around me. The confidence she carried earlier had completely disappeared. Now she looked like someone trying to understand a story she had never expected to hear. A Ford executive approached me through the reporters. Natalie, he said politely, we're organizing the executive reception upstairs shortly. I'll join you in a moment, I said. He nodded and stepped away again. The reporters continued asking questions for several more minutes. Eventually, the conversation slowed as they moved off to file their stories and upload footage. The noise of the gala slowly returned. Music resumed. Guests resumed conversations. But the glances in my direction hadn't stopped. I walked toward the edge of the room where my family was standing. They were silent as I approached. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. Madison was the first to break the silence. You founded Harper Strategic Capital? She asked. Yes. Her voice sounded almost fragile. But that company manages billions. That's correct. My father cleared his throat. How long? He asked. 5 years. My mother shook her head slowly. 5 years, she repeated. Madison looked down briefly, then back up at me. But you ride a bike, she said quietly. I couldn't help smiling slightly. Yes. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense to me. My father looked around the hall, at the executives still discussing the partnership, at the reporters typing quickly on their phones. All this time, he said slowly, we thought you were just working some quiet finance job. I was, Madison frowned. That's not a quiet job. Most finance work is invisible, I replied. She didn't answer, because she was realizing something uncomfortable. The version of success she had always celebrated. The cars, the cameras, the recognition had nothing to do with the work that had just reshaped an entire industrial supply chain. My mother spoke carefully. "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about that question for a moment. I tried. They looked at each other. Madison spoke again. "When?" "Several times." I glanced toward the stage where the presentation slides were still visible. "Remember 2 years ago at Thanksgiving when I mentioned restructuring a manufacturing company?" Madison blinked. "You mean that boring business thing?" "Yes." My father slowly rubbed his forehead. "And the time you said you were working with industrial suppliers?" "Yes." The realization began settling across their faces. They hadn't misunderstood my work. They had simply stopped listening. Madison looked at the floor. "I thought you were exaggerating," she admitted quietly. "I know." The music from the gala played softly in the background as guests continued networking around us, but our small circle felt strangely quiet compared to the rest of the room. Madison glanced toward the entrance. "Everyone heard what I said earlier," she murmured. "Yes," she swallowed slightly. "I told them you'd never be able to afford a Ford." I shrugged gently. "It happens." But the words hung between us anyway, because everyone in the room now understood the irony. The woman mocked for riding a bicycle had just financed one of the largest electric vehicle expansion projects in the industry. My father finally looked at me again. "You really built all of this?" "Yes." Madison let out a slow breath. "I don't think I understand you at all," she said. "That's okay," I replied calmly. "Most people don't." And across the hall, several Ford executives were already preparing for the next round of discussions about a partnership that my family had only just realized I controlled. The noise of the gala slowly returned, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere around us. Earlier in the evening, people had been laughing about a bicycle. Now small clusters of executives and investors were glancing in my direction while whispering quietly to one another. Across the hall, several journalists had already opened their laptops at cocktail tables, typing rapidly while the story was still fresh. I could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the room. "Harper Strategic Capital. She led the supplier restructuring. That's the firm behind the EV stabilization." My family heard it too. Madison stood completely still beside the table, as if the floor beneath her had shifted slightly and she wasn't sure where to step next. Then a reporter approached. He was young, carrying a press badge from an automotive industry publication. He stopped politely near Madison. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you related to Natalie Harper?" Madison hesitated. The confidence that usually defined her public voice had vanished. "Yes," she said finally. "She's my sister." The reporter's eyebrows lifted. "Your sister." He glanced briefly toward the far side of the hall where I was speaking with 2 Ford executives. "That's interesting." 2 more reporters joined him almost immediately. "Did you know she was involved in the EV expansion project?" one asked. Madison's voice tightened. "I knew she worked in finance. But did you know she founded Harper Strategic Capital?" Madison didn't answer right away. My mother stepped forward, trying to sound composed. "Our daughter doesn't usually talk about work," she said. The reporters exchanged quick glances. One of them scrolled through an article on his phone. "This firm has managed several $billion in industrial investments," he said quietly. He looked back at Madison. "That must make family dinners interesting." Madison forced a small laugh. "Yes, well..." But she couldn't finish the sentence, because 20 minutes earlier she had been telling strangers that her sister would probably never afford a Ford. The reporters thanked them politely and moved away again, already discussing the angle for their articles. Madison watched them leave. Then she looked at my parents. "They're going to write about this," she said quietly. My father nodded. "They already are." Around us, conversations were changing tone. Several guests who had laughed earlier were now speaking more cautiously. One woman in a dark business suit leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "That's the influencer who made the bike joke earlier." Her colleague nodded. "Not the best timing." My mother lowered her gaze slightly. Madison rubbed her hands together nervously. "I didn't know," she said again, but this time the words sounded different, less defensive, more uncertain. Across the hall, I was speaking with a group of Ford engineers who were explaining the next phase of the EV production expansion. One of them noticed Madison watching. "That's her family, right?" he asked quietly. Another executive nodded. "I think so." They didn't laugh. They didn't even smile. They simply turned their attention back to the discussion. The respect in their voices when they spoke to me was unmistakable. Madison saw that too. My father finally spoke. "You should stop talking to reporters," he said quietly. Madison nodded quickly. Yes, but the damage had already been done. The story had begun spreading through the room faster than anyone could control. Another journalist nearby read aloud from his phone. "Harper Strategic Capital manages multiple investment vehicles worth several $billion." Someone beside him added, "Founded by Natalie Harper at 24. Madison's shoulders tightened. "That can't be right," she whispered. My father took the phone from the reporter's table for a moment to read the article more carefully. His face slowly changed. "It is right," he said quietly. My mother stared at the screen. "That picture, that's her." Madison didn't look. She was still watching me across the hall. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to compete with the attention around her. She was trying to understand it. "Dad," she said softly, "she rode a bicycle here." "I know." And I laughed about it. Neither parent answered, because the truth had already revealed itself. A few minutes later, I finished the conversation with the Ford engineers and began walking back through the crowd. Several guests nodded respectfully as I passed. A few investors introduced themselves briefly. But when I reached the area where my family was standing, the noise of the gala seemed to fade again. Madison looked at me carefully. Not the way she used to. Not with amusement. With uncertainty. "Natalie," she said quietly. I stopped in front of them. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Madison took a small step forward. "I think we need to talk." I glanced toward the glass doors at the edge of the convention center. Outside, the cold Detroit night waited beyond the lights of the event. "Yes," I said calmly, "we probably do." We stepped away from the crowd and toward the quieter side of the convention hall, near the tall glass windows overlooking the Detroit River. The noise of the gala faded behind us, replaced by softer music and the distant murmur of conversations. Outside, the city lights reflected across the dark water, the skyline glowing faintly against the night. For a moment, none of us spoke. Madison was the first to break the silence. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "I know," I replied. My father folded his arms slowly. "You built a $1 billion investment firm," he said, "and we had no idea." "Yes," my mother shook her head slightly, "but you never told us." I looked out through the glass toward the river for a moment before answering. "I tried." They were quiet again, because they were remembering. 2 years ago at Thanksgiving dinner, I had mentioned a restructuring project involving a manufacturing supplier. Madison had laughed. Another one of Natalie's finance puzzles. Everyone had moved on to another conversation. Another time I had explained that I was working on an industrial investment connected to electric vehicles. My father had nodded politely before asking Madison about her latest brand partnership. After enough conversations like that, I had stopped explaining. Madison leaned against the window railing. "I thought you were exaggerating," she admitted. "About work." "I wasn't." She let out a slow breath. "I know that now." The music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the hallway behind us. Guests were still celebrating the Ford announcement, but our conversation felt like it existed outside of that moment. My father looked toward the entrance where the lights of the event spilled across the pavement. "You could have told us tonight," he said quietly. "I did," I replied. He frowned. "When?" "When you laughed about the bicycle." Madison closed her eyes briefly. "That was a joke." "Yes, but it wasn't meant to hurt you." "I know." That answer seemed to confuse her. She looked up again. "Then why didn't you say something right away?" I considered the question. "Because arguing wouldn't have changed anything." "What do you mean?" I nodded toward the ballroom where hundreds of people were still discussing the Ford partnership. "The truth already existed," I said. "It just hadn't reached you yet." Madison followed my gaze. You let the whole room find out before we did. Yes, she laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. That's brutal. I didn't plan it that way. My mother looked thoughtful. All these years, she said slowly, we thought Madison was the successful one. Madison didn't protest. Instead, she looked down at her shoes. I post pictures, she said quietly. That's my job. There's nothing wrong with that, I replied. But it's not the only definition of success. My father nodded slowly. I think we forgot that. Madison looked back at me. But the bicycle, she said again. You could buy any car you want. I could. Then why ride it? I smiled slightly. Because I like it. She blinked. That's it? Mostly. I leaned against the railing beside her. Most of my life is spent in boardrooms, I said. Negotiations, legal documents, investment strategies. I gestured toward the quiet river outside. Riding a bike reminds me that life can still be simple. Madison shook her head in disbelief. You rode a bicycle to a Ford car launch on purpose. Yes. The irony finally made her laugh for real. That might be the most powerful statement anyone made tonight. Maybe. Behind us, the doors of the ballroom opened and a group of executives walked past, still discussing the EV expansion project. One of them nodded respectfully as he passed me. Madison noticed. So what happens now? She asked. Now? With us. I thought about the question carefully. That depends. On what? Whether you still measure people by things like cars. She looked down again. I guess I've been doing that for a long time. Yes, she sighed. I'm sorry about earlier. I nodded. Thank you. Another quiet moment passed between us. Then Madison looked toward the entrance where my bicycle was locked to the railing outside. You're really riding that back to the hotel, aren't you? Yes, she shook her head again. I don't think I'll ever see bicycles the same way again. Good. I pushed away from the railing and started walking toward the exit. Behind me, Madison spoke one more time. Natalie, I stopped. I think we've been measuring success the wrong way our whole lives. For the first time that evening, no one disagreed. The gala was beginning to wind down by the time I returned inside. The loud excitement from earlier had softened into quieter conversations as guests finished their drinks and exchanged final business cards. The massive Ford logo above the stage still glowed under the lights, but the formal presentation had ended. Clusters of executives were already discussing follow-up meetings. Reporters packed their equipment while sending their last updates to editors. The night that had begun as a product launch had turned into something else entirely. A story. As I walked through the hall, several people nodded politely. Some investors introduced themselves briefly. A Ford engineer thanked me again for helping stabilize the supplier network. I shook hands, exchanged a few words, then continued toward the entrance. My family was still there. They had moved to a quieter table near the exit, waiting. Madison stood up when she saw me approaching. You're leaving? She asked. Yes. Back to the hotel? For tonight. My father looked around the hall once more, as if the reality of the evening was still settling into place. You really built all of this, he said quietly. Yes, my mother studied me carefully. For years we thought you were struggling. I know, Madison gave a small, awkward smile. I guess the bicycle didn't help. Probably not. The moment felt strangely calm now. Earlier in the night there had been laughter, embarrassment, confusion. Now there was simply understanding. Not complete understanding, but the beginning of it. Madison glanced toward the stage where the Ford executives were still speaking with investors. You helped finance the entire EV expansion, she said slowly. Part of it. That's still unbelievable. She paused. And I told a room full of people you'd probably never afford a Ford. I shrugged lightly. It happens. But you didn't argue. No. Why? I looked toward the glass doors leading outside, because the answer had always been simple. Because arguments rarely change people's minds, I said. What does? Reality. My father nodded slowly. That's exactly what tonight felt like. A reality. My mother folded her hands on the table. I think we spent years judging success by the wrong things, she said. Madison didn't disagree. She looked down at her phone for a moment, then placed it back on the table without opening it. "No photos tonight," she said. "That's new." She smiled slightly. "Some moments don't belong on social media." We walked together toward the entrance. Outside, the Detroit night air had grown colder. The lights from the convention center reflected across the street, and my bicycle was still locked to the railing exactly where I had left it. Madison looked at it again. She laughed softly. "I still can't believe this is your ride home." "It works. You could buy every car inside that building." "I could, but you still choose this." "Yes," she shook her head. "I used to think success meant people seeing what you have. And now? Now I think success might be when you don't need anyone to see it." I unlocked the bike and adjusted the helmet strap. My father stepped closer. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm proud of you." The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him, but they felt sincere. "Thank you." My mother hugged me quickly before stepping back. Madison crossed her arms and looked at the bicycle one last time. "You know," she said, "this might be the most expensive bike ride in Detroit tonight." "Probably." I pushed the bike forward onto the sidewalk. Behind me, the lights of the Ford Gala glowed through the glass walls of the convention center. Earlier that night, my family had laughed at the girl who arrived on 2 wheels. Now they understood that the quietest arrival in the room had carried the most influence. Sometimes success isn't loud. It doesn't come with spotlights or applause. Sometimes it's built quietly, decision by decision, far away from the cameras. And when the truth finally appears, it doesn't need to argue with anyone. It simply stands there. I placed one foot on the pedal and started riding toward the hotel. Behind me, the Ford Gala continued. Ahead of me, the quiet Detroit streets stretched beneath the city lights. And somewhere between those two worlds existed the life I had chosen. Not the one people expected, the one I built. If you were in Natalie's position, would you have revealed the truth in that moment? Or would you have stayed silent and let time expose everything on its own? Tell me honestly in the comments, and if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, family drama, and the kind of success that proves itself without shouting, stay with the channel and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't anger. It's success so undeniable that the people who doubted you finally see the truth for themselves. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.